In sports, nothing is permanent. Winners become losers, losers become winners. Everything eventually changes. And although at times it may seem like the teams at the top will never move from atop that mountain, eventually they all do to make room for the teams at the bottom. This offseason has been a whirlwind for many fan bases, for better or worse. We have seen a dramatic reshuffling, not just on rosters and coaching staffs, but a dramatic shift in the popular opinion of what franchises were run well. And to explain this, let's take a quick look back to just last year at this time. The Browns were coming off a 0-16 season, and while they made some positive steps in bringing in Jarvis Landry, they still didn't have a quarterback, and they retained Hugh Jackson as head coach of the Browns after going 1-31 in 2 years, a move that reasonably baffled the minds of a lot of people. The Browns were looked at as a bad organization whose ownership would stop them from competing. The Jets were also looked at in a similar, albeit less dramatically bad fashion. They were ridiculed for trading up from their 6th pick in the draft to the 3rd pick in the draft because it was thought that there would be no way the Jets would be able to get their guy with that pick, and that they essentially traded up to get the scraps of whatever the Browns and the Giants didn't want. And speaking of the Giants, despite having the number 2 overall pick in the draft, they weren't portrayed as helpless or as dysfunctional as the Jets and the Browns have. Because during the lead up to the draft, while those two teams were talked about as landing spots to avoid for young quarterbacks, the Giants were seen as the model franchise. And to their credit, they are the franchise that was Manning approved when San Diego wasn't, the franchise that slayed the almighty Patriots not once but twice. This was a team that while they had injuries and an aging quarterback, they were destined for a fast rebound, while franchises like the Jets and Browns remain trapped inside the same web of mediocrity that they've called home for over a decade. Not good enough to be fun, not bad enough to get good, just miserable. Meanwhile, teams like the Raiders and Jaguars seem destined to rise from the desolate and unremarkable ground that has been their recent past. The Jaguars were just off of the AFC Championship appearances and just a few plays away from slaying the Patriots. They brought in Tom Coughlin as president of football operations. They just locked down their quarterback of the future, and they had one of the best defenses in football. The Raiders were about a year removed from a playoff run that was cut short before it even started due to Derek Carr fracturing his fibula in Week 15. This past season was a bit of a disappointment, but Derek Carr was recovering from injury and the team had gotten rid of the coach that was holding them back and signed one of the biggest names in all of football to replace him, in John Gruden, to much fanfare. And then there were those teams, those organizations that were seemingly immune to mediocrity and dysfunction. Organizations like the Ravens, Steelers, and Patriots. The Patriots were fresh off of another Super Bowl appearance. The Steelers were looking for ways to bolster to their depth and add to an incredible core of 3 of the top players in football. Those players being, of course, Le'Veon Bell, Ben Roethlisberger, and Antonio Brown. The Ravens were a good young team recovering from a down year, and with a legend like Ozzie Newsome running the front office, there seemed to be very little doubt that the Ravens would be able to reload and become dominant again. This was the landscape of the NFL just a year ago. A landscape that, at the top and at the bottom, have been consistent for the better part of a decade. At this point, these things were almost virtual guarantees. And that was the way it was supposed to be. But unpredictably, that's not how things continued. The Giants, who were supposed to be the model franchise that was going to do the right thing and use its draft position in the draft that is very rare for an organization like the Giants to draft a Sam Darnold or Josh Rosen to get younger at quarterback to make the seamless transition from franchise quarterback to franchise quarterback that many other great organizations have, passed on that opportunity and picked Saquon Barkley at running back. The Giants, who had picked number 2 overall because of their poor play the season before, made a move that was for winning now. And the logic of a team that was picking number 2 overall, making a win now move, baffled a lot of people. The Giants then re-signed their elite young wide receiver talent Odell Beckham Jr. to a big but team-friendly deal, but then traded him a year later. They let some of their best young talent go, including one of the best safeties in football, Landon Collins. And in doing that, they seemingly signaled a rebuild. Teams that had a promising future the year before, like the Jaguars, regressed into the same disappointing, dysfunctional team that they were before their play. After signing their quarterback to a long-term deal, they decided that that quarterback was no longer the future and was indeed mediocre, and cut him. And spent a lot of money to bring in somebody like Nick Foles, who could either be great like he was in the Super Bowl or be the guy that was benched in favor of Case Keenum. The Raiders had the league buzzing a year before because of their addition of John Gruden. And now they're being criticized for hiring a guy whose West Coast offensive philosophy seems dated compared to the high-powered air raid offenses ran in Los Angeles and Kansas City. And even with the addition of Antonio Brown for virtually nothing for a player of his caliber, the Raiders seem in a confusing position directionally. In the lead up to last season, the Raiders traded away the best young defensive player in all of football in Khalil Mack for a couple of first-round picks. And during the season, they traded a good young star wide receiver in Amari Cooper for more first-round picks. It seemed as if the Raiders were taking the Sachi Brown Moneyball approach to rebuilding, stripping the team of all of its assets on the field in order to accumulate assets off the field in draft picks and cap space. But one thing with that is that the Sachi Brown strategy also includes getting younger. And the Raiders are one of the oldest teams in the NFL. And to further confuse that, they brought in a 30-year-old wide receiver, signed him to a huge deal, who seemingly won't be in his prime to play whenever this team gets to use all the assets they got from trading away their past talent. Even rising stars like Philadelphia's Carson Wentz has taken a backseat to the sudden emergence of guys like Patrick Mahomes, Jared Goff, and Baker Mayfield. The organizations that seem so immune to dysfunction, like Pittsburgh and New England, were consumed with headline-topping stories year-long about infighting. And while the Patriots were able to do what they always do and overcome and win it all, but this offseason the Patriots faced problems on and off the field. Robert Kraft, the owner of the Patriots, got caught up in a human trafficking scandal. Robert Gronkowski retired, and you always have to factor in the eventual aging or retirement of Bill Belichick and Tom Brady, who are both, mathematically speaking, approaching the end of their careers. The Steelers were unable to overcome their dysfunction, as their dysfunction consumed their season. Their star running back sat out the entire year while his own teammates jabbed and criticized him publicly to the media. And the Steelers' star receiver Antonio Brown, who was the center of so many highlights in the Killer Bee tandem, decided that he had had enough of whatever was going on in Pittsburgh. The Steelers didn't make the playoffs this year, and regardless of what you think of Juju and James, they're not Bell and Brown, and well, Ben is just getting older. The Ravens, for the first time in franchise history, have a huge question mark in the front office. Ozzie Newsome, who has ran the team excellently since the team began in 1996, is retiring, leaving Eric DeCosta in charge with huge shoes to fill. And then if you look at what used to be the bottom of the NFL, you'll see that the Jets were able to bring in 2 star players, one in CJ Mosley and the other being Le'Veon Bell, to build around their young quarterback Sam Darnold, who they were able to select with that number 3 pick because the Giants picked Saquon Barkley. The Browns were able to get their franchise quarterback when John Dorsey went against the grain and selected Baker Mayfield number 1 overall. And the Browns have amazingly become legitimate preseason Super Bowl contenders with their addition of Sheldon Richardson and Olivier Vernon to a defensive line that already featured Myles Garrett and Larry Ogunjobi, and adding Kareem Hunt and Odell Beckham, 2 top 5 players in their position groups, to an offense that already had guys like Nick Chubb, Jarvis Landry, and David Njoku. The Browns, who went 0-16 just a few years ago and were the butt of a lot of jokes, have now suddenly transformed into a team that has the potential to be the most dangerous in the NFL. In just a few years of time, the once remarkably consistent landscape of the NFL has seemingly shifted to the point to where it has crumbled. And it's about time. It's a change the NFL has needed for years, as old established stars like Aaron Rodgers and Tom Brady have lost their luster as far as fan interest is concerned. It seemingly is the end of a generation and the start of a new. A refreshing shakeup for the NFL and its fans. And it's time for a changing of the guard. It's time for the future.